Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Counterpoint podcast. This is our second episode in which we are going to talk more about 5G. I'm your host, Ritesh, and we have our VP and Research Director, Peter, to talk more about today's topic. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Ritesh, and hello, everyone. It's good to be here.
So, Peter, before we begin with our topic of the day, would you like to give our listeners a weekly update on the current coronavirus situation and also the companies that are affected due to it?
Yeah, so COVID-19 or the coronavirus outbreak has been a significant dampener on the market, particularly in China over the first part of the year. We're expecting that to spread to other markets going forward. Talking about China in particular in relation to coronavirus, the situation there seems to be settling down. And so we saw a big spike in infections, and that seems to be settling. But what we're now seeing is the emergence of the virus in other countries. From a China perspective, we expect that factory production will start to get back towards normal in most of China. I think the Hubei province, which is critical for several component manufacturers, may take a little bit longer to get back into full production. But it looks like the worst of the outbreak is behind us in China, which is positive for the global supply chain. But as I said earlier, now our focus is really kind of switching to other countries, and there are some which are rather concerning. Iran, has had quite a number of deaths from the virus, somewhat ahead of the reported number of infections. So that implies that there is a larger group of people that have been infected with the virus but have not been tested or recognized as such. And given Iran's importance for the Muslim community, so we've seen tourists coming back from in Iran to other Middle Eastern countries and carrying the virus with them. So there is an expectation that the contagion will develop in some of the Middle Eastern countries. Italy, as another significant number of infections in that country. Italy is a big tourist center, particularly around this time of year for skiing in the northern part of the country, and we've seen some infections spreading from Italy to other parts of Europe. And to our understanding, the infection seemed to be in the wild in Italy for several weeks before the first case was noted. And I think that this is the sort of pattern that we're going to see elsewhere. One of the other countries that we're sort of focusing quite a bit on is the USA. Again, there seems to have been situations where people are being infected from a kind of a community infection point of view, which suggests that, again, the virus was in the wild before it was properly recognized. So, adding all this up, we're seeing the supply chain maybe from China starting to return to normal, but with infections spreading to other markets in the world, and there's now very many countries that have reported infections, what we're likely to see is that demand from retail sales will be impacted. So it's far too early to say that we're sort of seeing the end of this. I think we're seeing a development in the viral outbreak situation, and that will continue to develop over the next several months. Our expectation is that we will probably be through the worst of this by the end of the second quarter, but it could drag on into the third quarter even.
Okay, so now getting back to our main topic, the cellular technologies, they have quite evolved over the past 3 decades. So, can you talk a little in depth about how things have progressed?
Yeah, so talking about our main topic, 5G, we put out a little chart which listeners can find. It's out on LinkedIn and Twitter. Basically, it shows the sales of cellular phones since for the last 30 years. Pretty much period that I've been active in the industry. It's interesting in lots of ways. I think probably the one thing that stands out for me is just how resilient 2G, particularly GSM, has been over the last 30 years. It continues to be an important technology, and is obviously the backbone of most networks. So if you fall back from one of the more advanced technologies like 4G, you will end up on 2G typically, because that's the most sort of prevalent technology around. What's also interesting from chart is that 3G really, didn't ever sort of make a big impact. It was reasonably strong through the sort of the late noughties, if I call it that, sort of, through 2008 to sort of around 2012, 2013. But then once 4G had really sort of lifted off, 3G fell away quite sharply. 4G has had a strong run, and that's really coincidental with the rise of sort of smartphone ownership across the world. The two kind of go hand in hand, so there is a kind of a relationship between the two, and then obviously we're now coming into the transition to 5G, which we're seeing right now.
So, are we expecting 5G to grow faster than 4G?
I think we will, our view is that 5G will lift off faster than 4G, but it's, will one be faster than the other? It's a kind of a yes and no. Will 5G be faster than 4G? I would say it's a kind of a yes and no. So, as I say, 4G was coincident with the rise in ownership of smartphones. What we've seen more recently is that the replacement rate of smartphones across the world has slowed down. So there's a question mark whether 5G will kind of re-engage users and get them to, drive an uplift in the replacement rate. I think that's, maybe a little bit doubtful. I think there will be some pressure to replace, but not immediately, because the networks just aren't there yet. But what we are seeing is that 5G is coming to lower cost phones more rapidly than 4G did. So you're seeing with Qualcomm's launch of the Snapdragon 7 series and 6 series that are coming to 5G, and several companies like Xiaomi and Realme launching really quite capable 5G products, within the sort of the $500 realm. It is coming down the price bands quite quickly. So, this will drive 5G smartphone uptake. But then some of the other benefits that accrue from the shift to 5G won't really be seen for, a year or two yet. So there will be a kind of we think, a much longer run for 5G, but some of those benefits won't really accrue immediately, and so we'll see a sort of a gradual, strengthening build in terms of 5G connections, over the next number of years.
Okay, and Peter, what can you talk about the current progress of the global 5G deployment in terms of the countries with 5G availability, the operators, and more?
Yeah, so thinking about the progress of global 5G deployments, it's what we saw in 2019 was a number of operators rushing to claim to be the first to launch 5G. We saw that in South Korea initially, and then closely followed by the USA. And a number of other countries around the world have launched 5G. Switzerland, UK, some of the other European countries, some of the Nordic countries, are live with 5G now. But other countries and operators are taking a little bit longer to come to the market. Some of this has to do with just spectrum auctions and how quickly those are being done. Other things that are sort of slightly holding it up, I would say that if you think about the the 5 Ps in relation to marketing. I would add a couple more. So there's what I would say is sort of plans and planning. Maybe that's 1 or 2 Ps, and then permission being a third. So if we talk about those briefly, so plans and planning. So one is business plans. So a lot of the operators that we've spoken to haven't really, got comfortable with the cost of building out 5G relative to the expected returns that they will get from having 5G out there. So, them working through their business plans is a kind of a key issue. In terms of planning, thinking here about the network planning. So getting base station sites is increasingly difficult. There are various concerns about the build out of infrastructure. Some of those are health related, maybe spurious. Others are just the fact that, for example, building owners are demanding very high rents for space on buildings. So if you're building out a new network, and you don't have the required base station sites, it can be very difficult to acquire those sites and then build out the network. So there's an issue around that. The third P, permission, comes to, partly is related to, what we're just talking about in terms of planning permission, but also around the permission to use infrastructure from certain suppliers. So Huawei is perhaps the leading 5G infrastructure supplier at the moment, but there is this underlying concern about the security issues surrounding Huawei, and that is causing operators a good deal of trouble. So if we look at the UK, for example, so there was a decision made by the government last year that allowed Huawei to be a part of the 5G build out, but on a somewhat restricted basis. So operators can use Huawei as part of their infrastructure, but up to a limit of 30% of any particular equipment, and also the 30% rule applies to data traffic as well. And Huawei equipment can't be used around sort of sensitive sites such as airports, power stations, and so on. Now, for many of the operators in the UK, they've built out their 4G networks using Huawei infrastructure. So, there would be a kind of a logical progression to use Huawei in the 5G network, and they are now having to kind of rethink the way in which they configure their network with a number of different suppliers, and sort of thinking through how that works. Makes it quite a challenge to build the network, and at the same time manage the Huawei content to this sort of 30% limit. So this permission angle, this extra P, has to be thought through. So we have a number of kind of factors that make the build out of 5G infrastructure much more complex, perhaps, than 4G was, and that is slowing will likely slow the rollout of 5G over the next year to 3 years, I would say.
Okay, now 5G has been made available via both millimeter wave and sub-6 bands. So how challenging is it for smartphone makers to support both of these bands?
Yeah, so thinking about 5G from also from a spectrum perspective, we do have the potential that 5G can exist in many different frequency bands, from relatively low frequency ranges. So what we're seeing in the US, for example, in the sort of 600 megahertz frequency bands, all the way up to millimeter wave, above 26 gigahertz. Now, as many of the listeners will understand, there's dramatically different radio propagation characteristics across those frequency bands, which has an impact on things like network planning. but also, in relation to the smartphone itself. So, particularly down to things like antenna design and the radio front end support within the device. It's quite challenging to manage all of those bands. So the higher frequencies in the millimeter wave spectrum, the radio propagation is such that it's very easy to block those signals. So the antenna design and the positioning of those antennas on the device is particularly important to allow for the radio propagation to work correctly. So, it is going to add cost and complexity to smartphone design, and we're seeing that with some of the earlier smartphone launches where there will be specific SKUs that are aimed at markets where millimeter wave is currently present, like in the USA. And you're seeing, for example, Huawei in its own 5G smartphones is not supporting millimeter wave because, for the reasons that we all understand, it's not it's not able to sell product in the USA. It's actually not able to sell products in most of the rest of the world either, but for different reasons relative to Android. So it's really kind of focusing its chipset efforts on the sub-6 gigahertz wave bands.
So in countries where 5G is currently available, what is the pricing and free data allowance like compared to 4G?
Yeah, so in countries where 5G is available, there's no kind of standard approach to pricing. We're seeing, some markets like Switzerland, for example, where there's extraordinarily high prices for 5G. In others, it's there's no real kind of premium to 5G over 4G. In fact, in some countries, China, it's actually in some cases a little bit cheaper to use 5G than 4G. If I take the case of the UK, and in particular one operator, Vodafone, what we've seen here is that they have created essentially an all-you-can-eat plan, but then there are some volume limited plans which don't look like tremendous value. So there's a kind of a pressure to try and shift consumers onto all-you-can-eat plans. The pricing of which is it's quite attractive, particularly relative to the volume limited plans. So I think what we'll see increasingly is operators trying to kind of shift their consumers onto these all-you-can-eat plans that will have a short-term benefit to them in terms of bumping up ARPUs, but longer term it will mean that there's perhaps less potential to drive greater upsides to the to the revenue. But 5G has this potential to enable the consumption of a lot of content, and I guess operators are angling at a playing a role in the delivery and management of that of those content relationships, where they can potentially then make some additional revenue either directly from consumers or as an aggregator and distributor of that content.
So now that smartphone sales have been dipped due to the coronavirus outbreak, will this also impact on the estimated 5G shipments that we were expecting this year?
So as a final thought, we've certainly seen sales dipping in markets where coronavirus has been present. We saw a very sharp decline in China through that kind of critical period in the January-February timeframe, and all of Q1 will be quite severely impacted. That's likely to spread more generally, but maybe at a slightly lower level across the globe. That will have some impact on 5G shipments. Exactly how significant that will be, we have some forecasts out where we're trying to quantify what we think is the impact of the coronavirus outbreak. We're keeping a kind of a close eye on how this outbreak develops and what the impact will be on retail activity in general. But sure, there will be some, and the development of the disease is makes it very challenging to really kind of develop concrete idea of this. But I think we're looking at various different scenarios. As we get more information, we will be able to determine which one of those scenarios is most likely to come out in the through the rest of the year. So yeah, keep talking to us, and we'll keep you informed as we go forward here.
Well, I think that was a pretty insightful conversation. Thanks, Peter, for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Ritesh. Good talking to you, and keep tabs on Counterpoint, and look forward to talking to you again.